Hi everybody. Hope everything's going well and that you watched the other 3 lectures that have been posted. This is the next lecture and we are covering the politics of the 1960s. There will be the actual slides are, like all the other chapters, are posted on Brightspace as well. So you can go through these slides on your own. If you can't see them good behind me, maybe you have them up and while you're listening to me, you might want to look at them in a different window, whatever works best for you. Everything is possible on your exams, so make sure you're reading all the extra material that I have posted. Email me questions. When we have our WebEx meetings, that's going to be a time for you guys to ask questions until we get through the rest of this semester. I really think we're going to be doing this online for a while. Okay, so let's get started with the 1960s. Where we left off, Eisenhower leaves office, 1961. The Democrats pick John F. Kennedy from Massachusetts to run for president. He is nominated in the Democratic Convention in 1960. Kennedy was elected to Congress 1946, the same year as Richard Nixon. They're actually friends. Their offices, while they were in Congress and when they were in the Senate, were right by each other. And they were friendly with each other. They would find themselves on opposite sides of this election. Kennedy came to prominence in 1956. He unsuccessfully sought the Democratic vice presidential nomination. Fortunately for him, he didn't get it, but it helped raise his profile. His father, if you remember, we talked about him during the Depression and run-up to World War II. Joseph P. Kennedy, multimillionaire from Massachusetts, was the first chairman of the Security Exchange Commission that regulates the stock market after the Great Depression. Joseph Kennedy was smart, got out of the stock market before it crashed, saw it coming, would eventually be ambassador to England in the run-up to World War II. He believes we should stay out of the war. Because of this, Roosevelt will replace him as ambassador, and his political career gets derailed. He looks to his sons as the future. His oldest son, Joseph Jr., is killed in a bombing mission in 1944. So he puts all his energy towards his second son, Jack. Because Kennedy's from Massachusetts, he knows he needs a vice presidential candidate from the South. Lyndon Johnson was his opponent during the primary campaign. Kennedy realizes Johnson, he was the Senate Majority Leader, had been in the Senate for a long time, was an experienced legislator, would bring that balance to the ticket. So we have JFK and LBJ running on the Democratic side. Kennedy was Catholic, only the second Catholic to run for president. The first Catholic, Al Smith, in the 1920s, lost big time. There were a lot of people at this time that were worried about a Catholic president, worried that a Catholic president would be more subservient to the Pope than he would be to the people. Today we kind of scoff at this. It's not that big a deal. It was back then. Kennedy addressed this to the Greater Houston Ministerial Association. He says, "I believe in an America where separation of church and state is absolute, where no Catholic prelate would tell the president, should he be Catholic, how to act, and no Protestant minister would tell his parishioners for whom to vote, where no church or church school is granted any public funds or political preference, and where no man is denied public office merely because of his religion differs from the president who might appoint him or the people who might elect him." This works. Kennedy is able to calm the fears of people. Remember back in 1858, we talked about the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Famously, Abraham Lincoln debating Stephen A. Douglas around the state of Illinois, running for a Senate seat. That was the last debate in our country that was really well known until 1960. A new tradition is established. 4 televised debates. The Republican Kennedy the Democrat Kennedy versus the Republican Vice President Richard Nixon.
The television and radio stations of the United States and their affiliated stations are proud to provide facilities for a discussion of issues in the current political campaign by the 2 major candidates for the presidency.
All the institutions arrayed against a president, Richard Nixon once wrote, none controls his fate more than television. As for why Nixon came to regard television as an adversary, one need look no further than the 1960 election year debate between Nixon and his rival for the presidency, John F. Kennedy. That event was the first of its kind to be broadcast on national television. It permanently altered the political landscape. It changed not only how America selects its leaders, but why. It was like Miss America. You pick the more attractive of the 2 men. And that's how Jack Kennedy beat Richard Nixon. He turned out to be the more attractive guy. At the time, Senator Kennedy was far less familiar to the American public than was Nixon. But on television, his good looks and evident composure provided an excellent calling card.
If we fail to move ahead, if we fail to develop sufficient military and economic and social strength here in this country, then I think that the tide could begin to run against us. I don't want historians 10 years from now to say, these were the years when the tide ran out in the United States. I want them to say, these were the years when the tide came in. These were the years when the United States started to move again.
Up to that point, he was this good-looking guy from Massachusetts. He looked like a Harvard undergrad. You know, he was well-tailored, he was handsome, he was glamorous. I think, in hindsight, Nixon must have said to himself, why did I do that? I mean, why did I give this guy the exposure? I mean, I was his press agent. Jack Kennedy making speeches is a bore. Jack Kennedy debating Richard Nixon is an event.
Kennedy arrived at the TV studios in Chicago on the afternoon of September 26th, looking tanned and well-rested.
He wanted to know, where do I stand? How long do I have to answer? Will I get a warning when I've gone too far? I mean, he really wanted to know the nuts and bolts of what we're going to do. Jack Kennedy knew that an election could ride on this television appearance. Nixon thought it was just another campaign appearance.
The main thing missing from the great debate was a debate.
I think if the United States is maintaining a strong society here in the United States, I think that we can meet any internal threat. The major threat is external and will continue. Mr. Nixon, comment?
I agree with Senator Kennedy's appraisal generally in this respect. The question of communism within the United States has been one that has worried us in the past. It is one that will continue to be a problem for years to come.
People who watched it on television thought Kennedy won. People who heard it on radio thought Nixon won.
But their first televised encounter remained significant for another reason. It was the night when political campaigners and television executives came together and discovered that they were made for each other.
In the middle of this thing, the politicians are looking at the television executives and thinking, those guys have a reach in everybody's living room. The television guys are looking at the politicians and saying, they're a source of unlimited advertising dollars. That's a bottomless pit. That night changed the face of American politics. That was the night that television and politics eyed each other, flirted with each other, got engaged, and eventually got married. And because of that, you cannot hold office in the United States of America, or even think about running for office, unless you've got the money to buy television time. Politics in America is now a money game, and it all weaned off the night of the first television debate.
70 million Americans, at the time the largest political audience in U.S. history, watched the first televised debate. In November 1960, Kennedy defeated Nixon in one of the closest presidential elections in history, and many believed that the debates had made the difference.
It quite possibly could have. In that debate, like the man in that, Jesus, Walter Cronkite, he was a famous news anchor from the 1960s, 1970s, all the way to the early 1980s before he retired, the most trusted man in news. He was the CBS nightly news anchor. We'll visit Cronkite several more times later on in different eras here. Nixon, as he said, treated it as another campaign thing. Kennedy understood television. Nixon did not. Nixon refused to put makeup on. You know, when you go on TV, they put makeup on you because of the glare of the lights. Kennedy took the advice of the pros, put the makeup on. He looked better. Nixon looked rougher, more haggard looking. Kennedy, a better looking guy in general anyway, came across better. As Don Hewitt, the other gentleman that they interviewed, he was the guy that produced the debate. He said people watching it thought Kennedy won. People listening to it on radio thought Nixon won. Kennedy also would get some help from his father. There's been one of the closest elections we've ever had. There was dispute of elections and results in West Virginia and in Chicago, where they thought votes were bought, where the mafia in Chicago aided Kennedy because Joseph Kennedy had mafia connections from his days as a bootlegger in the 1920s. So did Kennedy really win? Well, he gets elected and he is inaugurated. Here's Kennedy and his wife, young family. This is the first two Navy lieutenants. Nixon, actually it was a lieutenant commander. Kennedy, Navy lieutenant, fought each other. Remember that clip from Tell It to the Marines that we watched a while back about the guys, I'm going to go home and I'm going to run for office. That was Kennedy and Nixon.
I'm going to be a lawyer. Who says in 10 years from now I won't be a congressman? I'm going into politics with both feet. And if I have anything to say about it, my kid isn't going to land on any beachhead. And if any old windbag tries to sell me the idea of shipping oil to Japan or doing business with any new Hitler, he better start ducking.
So we have the torch passed from the newly elected President Kennedy to from the outgoing Dwight Eisenhower. Here's Jack and Jackie Kennedy, young, good-looking couple, sailing. This would usher their family, John and Caroline, first time in probably since, I think, I don't know if it's Grover Cleveland, since there was children, presidential, well, Teddy Roosevelt, at least, children being raised in the White House, was the Kennedys. So it was this young, hopeful, new frontier, a new outlook, people looking to the future. Look at the glamorous Jackie Kennedy, what a pretty lady she was. Smart, young, vibrant, replacing Mamie Eisenhower, a grandmother. She was America's grandmother. Now we have this young First Lady. Kennedy's charisma. Everyone wanted to shake his hand. What they didn't know was Jack Kennedy suffered from a ton of health problems. He badly injured his back in World War II when his destroyer was sunk. PT-109, his PT boat, was sunk by a Japanese destroyer. He also had a condition called Addison's disease, an autoimmune disease. He was in back braces a lot of times. He was getting injections Probably high on drugs a lot of the time, to be honest. What we didn't really know at the time, he was getting these tranquilizers to keep him going. People didn't know that. Much like FDR was in a wheelchair, they didn't know about Kennedy's problems either. He was the first TV president. They called it the Age of Camelot. There was a famous musical around this time called Camelot, based on King Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table. They said this was an American Camelot. He brought this glamour to the White House, these black tie and evening gown affairs. Here the Kennedys honor the famous poet Robert Frost. Many of you should know Robert Frost from your English classes. The poem, The Road Less Traveled. That's Robert Frost, Poet Laureate of the United States during the Kennedy administration. Kennedy faces the first crisis with Cuba. Cuba, during the Eisenhower years, had gone communist. A domino had fallen. Fidel Castro is in charge of Cuba now. The Soviet Union, wanting to test this young president, makes a deal with Castro for arms if he'll allow missile bases to be set up in Cuba. Soviets are starting to build nuclear missile bases in Cuba, which would make it capable for the Soviets to strike any place on the eastern half of the United States. We find out about it, and there's a face-off between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Kennedy orders he's under enormous pressure from his military chiefs to attack. Kennedy knows if we attack, we're in a nuclear war. What can I do short of attacking? He orders a blockade of Cuba, goes out in public. They expose what the Soviets are doing. He has his UN ambassador, Adlai Stevenson, go to the UN Security Council and show what the Russians are doing. We face down the Soviets. And here you can see Kennedy and Khrushchev. We make Kennedy tell the show back down at Castro Gulch. This is Nikita Khrushchev from the Soviet Union dropping his guns and backing away from Kennedy. Crisis averted. Kennedy's popularity soars. He says, "We stand at the age of a new frontier, the frontier of unfulfilled hopes and dreams. It will deal with unsolved problems of peace and war, unconquered pockets of ignorance and prejudice, unanswered questions of poverty and surplus." Kennedy starts the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps is still in existence today. This is a way for young men and women to give back into public service. You go into the Peace Corps, you'll go to third world countries in Africa and South America and help villages dig wells, improve their lives, introduce democracy to these countries, introduce through peaceful means instead of military means. Kennedy was the one to create the Peace Corps. Actually, his brother-in-law, a man by the name of Sergeant Shriver, will be the first executive director of the Peace Corps. Physical fitness. I told you, Kennedy had a lot of health problems, but his family was real big into athletics and football. And this is Jack and his brother and sister-in-law playing on the beach, playing football on the beach. This is when we see the Presidential Physical Fitness Challenge. Walking challenge creates a fad for 50-mile hikes. Hiking becomes an activity. The official U.S. physical fitness program was started under John F. Kennedy. You might have heard of the Presidential Physical Fitness Test. It's still around today. Here's meeting President Kennedy fuels a young man's political ambitions. This young man right here shaking hands with President Kennedy is a young Bill Clinton, who would become, a few decades later, would become President of the United States himself. Clinton says Kennedy inspired him into politics. Now, some of you know about John F. Kennedy. He was also a notorious womanizer, had many affairs while he was president. So would Bill Clinton. So he emulated Kennedy in more ways than one. But a lot of people blamed Kennedy for being treasonous against the Constitution, especially in the South. These alt-right, what we would call alt-right groups, thought he was soft on communism because because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. They thought we should have attacked. He is betraying our friends. This is wanted for treason. They put out these wanted posters. Betraying the Constitution to which he is sworn to uphold. He is turning the sovereignty of the U.S. over to a communist-controlled United Nations. He has been wrong on innumerable issues, including the security of the U.S. The Berlin Wall is built while Kennedy is president. That's when the Soviet Union will erect the wall, permanently separating East and West Berlin. Illegally invaded sovereign state with federal troops. This is when he sent troops to allow segregation of schools. He has consistently appointed anti-Christians to federal office, upholds the Supreme Court and its anti-Christian rulings. He has been caught in fanatic lies to the American people, including personal ones like his previous marriage and divorce. There was no previous marriage and divorce, but they made up fake news. This isn't new. This would all lead in 1963, November 22nd, 1963. Kennedy is looking at the 1964 election. He needs to shore up the Democratic Party in the South. Lyndon Johnson from Texas urges him, you need to go to Texas and give a goodwill tour and repair the fractures of the party. So Kennedy and Johnson both go to Texas. They do a couple stops in Texas. It's scheduled to be in Dallas on the morning of November 22nd. Kennedy's motorcade. Here's Kennedy and his wife in the back seat of the limo. And there's 3 rows in this limo. The second row is Texas Governor John Connally and his wife. Kennedy is assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald, who fires from the Texas School Book Depository in Dallas. As Kennedy's limo is turning a corner, open air limo, Oswald fires from below. Everything changes. There's been numerous conspiracy theories. Did Lee Harvey Oswald act alone? Lee Harvey Oswald was a communist. He wasn't an alt-right anti-segregationist. He was pro-Castro. He had actually was an ex-Marine, had defected to the Soviet Union, lived in the Soviet Union for several years, married a Soviet wife, hated it over there because it was bleak, and he thought he would get treated better as an American defector. Comes back to America, can't barely hold a job, finds a job in the School Book Depository. It's basically a book warehouse for the Texas Board of Education for textbooks. He uses a mail-ordered Italian bolt-action rifle to kill the president. Many have debated, they said it's like a 1 in a million shots that he was able to do this. But studies have shown that it was possible. They have never been able to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that anyone but Oswald did it. But a few days after Oswald was arrested, this man, Jack Ruby, a nightclub owner in Dallas with connections to the mob, supposedly was so upset about Oswald killing the president that he, as they are transferring Oswald from the Dallas jail He runs up and shoots Oswald and kills him. This is Oswald being killed. Ruby never changes his story, dies in prison of cancer a few years later. Some think Ruby was a tool of the mob to shut Oswald up, that he had cancer, knew he didn't have many years to live, and was paid off. Again, never proven. So Vice President Johnson takes the oath of office aboard Air Force One. Here's Johnson's wife, Lady Bird. Jackie Kennedy standing next to him. She is still wearing the outfit covered in her husband's blood. She refuses to take it off until she is back in Washington because she tells Mrs. Johnson, I want them to see what they did to Jack. The Kennedy family famously bids farewell to their father, brother, and son. Here's John F. Kennedy Jr. famously saluting his father's coffin as it passes by. Lyndon Johnson would take John Kennedy's social goals and expand on them and form what he calls the Great Society as a domestic policy movement to eradicate poverty in America. LBJ depicted as a superhero, why pointing to America, why that could be a great society. Johnson as a politician was an SOB. He was hard. He got what he wanted. He knew how to twist arms. This is what's called the Johnson treatment. He would get so close to you and lean down as a tall guy. See how he leans down and gets right in this guy's personal space. Gets his arms on him. He'd twist your arm, twist your leg, and would get you to agree to what he wanted. You know, you're going to support me on this bill, right, buddy? And he was famous for this. Johnson was a crude man. This was a commercial they ran in 1964 when Johnson was running for re-election. Johnson was facing Barry Goldwater of Arizona in the 1964 presidential election. Barry Goldwater was a extreme conservative. Johnson used that famous commercial that if Barry Goldwater is elected, we're going to get into a nuclear war. And he says that's the famous Daisy commercial. I know it doesn't seem too powerful now, but back in the 1960s it was. Johnson would win in a huge landslide. Other than Arizona, the only states Goldwater won was the South. This is when you see the South flip from Democrat to Republican permanently, or at least to this day. Republican elephant with a huge headache. It's a new day. It's a hangover. Johnson signs the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Martin Luther King is among the witnesses. Johnson gives him one of the pens. Famous law protecting the rights of African Americans, which would lead to the, as I said in our earlier chapter, the National Voting Rights Act of 1965, which ended all those Jim Crow laws in the South. He starts the war on poverty the Job Corps, community action, urban renewal, pouring money into making our cities better. It doesn't always work. He creates Medicare. We've had Social Security since Franklin Roosevelt. Now we have retirement medical insurance for senior citizens. Part of the Great Society. In 1970, 2 years out of office, Johnson says, "I knew from the start I was bound to be crucified either way I moved. If I left the woman I really loved, the Great Society, in order to get involved with that bitchable war on the other side of the world, Vietnam, I would lose everything at home. All my programs, all my hopes to feed the hungry and shelter the homeless, all my dreams to provide education and medical care to the browns and the blacks and the lame and the poor. But if I left that war and let the communists take over South Vietnam, I would be seen as a coward, and my nation would be seen as an appeaser and would find it impossible to accomplish anything anywhere around the globe." We will talk in the next unit about Vietnam and the price Johnson paid politically. He was in a no-win situation. What he should have done was never got into Vietnam in the first place. Kennedy and Eisenhower got us into Vietnam, and we'll talk about that. But Johnson escalated it. He had the chance to pull it back down. There's a large amount of evidence that if Jack Kennedy would not have been assassinated, he was going to pull what little troops we had in Vietnam out because he saw it wasn't a winnable situation. Johnson should have done that, did not.
I have concluded that I should not permit the presidents to become involved in the partisan divisions that are developing in this political year. With America's sons in the field far away, with America's future under challenge right here at home, with our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office. I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
So Johnson realizes he can't win. This is in 1968. The primaries have already started. He knows it's going to be tough. He shocks everybody and backs out. During this time, Martin Luther King, there's plenty of hatred coming his way as he becomes a national figure coming out of the 1963 March on Washington. They're accusing him of being a communist. He's been arrested several times for leading these nonviolent protests. This would culminate in 1968. He is shot to death in April of 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee, while standing on the balcony of his hotel. He's killed by a man named James Earl Ray. Bobby Kennedy, Jack Kennedy's brother, Attorney General under Jack Kennedy, after his brother's assassination, would become senator from New York, gets in the race. There's a big groundswell for another Kennedy to get into office. When Martin Luther King is assassinated, Bobby Kennedy is giving a speech in Indianapolis to an inner city crowd. He is the one to break the news to the crowd that Martin Luther King was assassinated. I wish I had that clip. I'll try to put it online for you. When the news that King's assassinated breaks out, there are riots in inner cities all over the country. Cities burn. Kennedy gives this famous speech, calms the crowd in Indianapolis, and Indianapolis is one of the few major cities that remains calm that night. In 1968, Kennedy wins the California primary, the last big state primary before the Democratic convention in Chicago. It's just about enough to get him to where he needs to be, to where he can win the nomination. He's walking through after giving his victory speech, is walking through the kitchen of the hotel, and he is assassinated by a man named Sirhan Sirhan, a deranged Lebanese man. Here he is. It's a famous photo. This is a busboy cradling his head. He's critically wounded, shot in the back of the head in 1968. So as August, we move to the Democratic Convention in Chicago. There are extreme protests. The city erupts in violence. Hubert Humphrey, who is Johnson's vice president, will become the nominee in a fractured party. There's a white backlash. Governor George Wallace, a Democrat, runs on the third party ticket, taking votes away from the Democrats. Nixon comes back and runs on the Republican side. Here's Wallace with his Ku Klux Klan Hitler base. Statue of Liberty with the burning cross and Confederate flag draped. Wallace's third party. Wallace gets almost 10 million votes, wins these 5 southern states. Nixon carries most of the rest of the country, defeats Humphrey. Back in 1962, Kennedy famously gave a speech and said, challenging America to go to the moon by the end of the 1960s. He said, we chose to go to the moon. We chose to go to the moon in this decade and do the things not only because they are easy, but because they are hard. He knows it's going to be tough, but we can do it. 1969, under Richard Nixon, Kennedy's dream is fulfilled. The eagle has landed, and the man lands on the moon. This would end the political struggles in the 1960s. Politics of the 1960s. We'll talk in the next 2 chapters about Vietnam and the social struggles in the 1960s.